Swinging his blackthorn at the marsh weeds, he prophesied above our scraggy acres, then turned away towards his promised furrows on the hill, a wake of pollen drifting to our bank, next season's tares. And it's that word tares, like germinate, that sort of makes you stop and you think, that's an unusual word. Where did I hear that before? And there's only one place you can ever get that word, really, which is in the King James Bible.
Welcome to the Lowell Humanities Series, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being here. I'm Charlie Sennott, and I have the great honor of introducing our speaker tonight. I teach here at Boston College. I'm a journalist for the Boston Globe at GBH, and I run something called the Ground Truth Project. And truly an honor to be with you here tonight. The origin of this Lowell Humanities series goes back to the Steinman Visiting Poets series of 1957 to 1958. The inaugural speaker was the American poet Robert Frost. One of the most celebrated poets in American history, a proud New Englander, the first poet to speak at a presidential inauguration, Frost honored President Kennedy with his poetry and famously advised him to always be more Irish than Harvard. Through the decades, other poets to speak in this series included T.S. Eliot, Maya Angelou, E.E. Cummings, and a list that would include, of course, Ireland's Nobel Prize-winning poet, Seamus Heaney. In fact, Heaney spoke 4 times in this series, between 1979 and 1996. So let's talk about that first year of this series, 1958. Within weeks of this humanities series getting underway and Robert Frost reading here at Boston College, far away on the other side of the pond, on February 16th, 1958, Fintan O'Toole was born in Dublin, the son of a bus conductor. Fintan would come of age in the Crumlin housing estate, and he would go on to become one of Ireland's leading public intellectuals. That amazing journey from public housing to public intellectual is beautifully told in Fintan O'Toole's latest book, a #1 bestseller, We Don't Know Ourselves, A Personal History of Ireland Since 1958. I told Fintan today that I have the most beautiful hardcover copy of this book that he signed, and this book is so good. I have 4 sons. 2 of them have read it, and one of them left it on a beach, and it was raining, and now it's like that thick. It's that thick. So I'm going to have to get you to sign another one, Fintan. Fintan has had truly an extraordinary career, and this book caps that career. It was published in 2021. It won Book of the Year at Irish Book Awards, and the New York Times named it one of the 10 best books of 2022. Fintan's storied career as a journalist has too many awards to list, but one of them is the Orwell Prize. Last spring, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's a columnist for the Irish Times, where he has worked for 35 years. And he is the Leonard Milberg Visiting Lecturer in Irish Letters at Princeton University. So divining a bit of wisdom from Robert Frost, we might advise Fintan, always be more Irish than Princeton. And my friends at the Irish Studies program have suggested we might also remind you that you can't get more Irish than Boston College. Fintan also contributes to the New York Review of Books, the New Yorker, Granta, The Guardian, The Observer, and other international publications. This Lowell lecture will herald the opening of Seamus Heaney, Afterlives, Boston College's international symposium marking the 10th anniversary of the poet's death. And we are very lucky tonight to gather around the words of the man who is Seamus Heaney's official biographer. Please welcome Fintan O'Toole.
Thank you very much, Charlie, for that wonderful and undeserved introduction. Everything is going to be downhill after that, I can guarantee you. It's such an honor to speak in this magnificent series, which I don't feel at all worthy to be in that magnificent list of people. And it's such a lovely pleasure to have Mary and Catherine Heaney here with us this evening. Slightly terrifying as well to speak about Seamus in such company. I do remember, I think probably the scariest thing that ever happened to me was the great Irish playwright Brian Friel, and also, of course, a great friend of Seamus Heaney's. It was his 80th birthday celebrations. His 80th birthday celebrations went on for about 3 years, I think, but it was one of the years of his 80th birthday anyway. And I was speaking in Donegal in Glenties, where a lot of his work is set. I was all fine. I was giving this talk, about Brian Friel, and the door opened just as I was getting to the podium, and Brian Friel came very slowly up and walked and sat in the front row. And I was absolutely certain he was going to, at some point, say, "That's rubbish. What you're saying is just rubbish." And, Seamus would be far too gracious to do that, I know, and I know I've sworn Mary and Catherine to not heckle, at least. So, but it is a wonderful occasion here, I think, to mark the 10th anniversary of Seamus's death. The sense of loss hasn't diminished, I think, in Ireland and around the world. But also, I think that space has been filled by more and more appreciation, really, of the extraordinary body of work that he left us, and the extraordinary example of how to conduct oneself in public, and how much that matters more than ever in these very, very dark times. My title is Political Heaney, and I'm not going to attempt to talk in the time we have about the very complex and wide-ranging sets of relationships between Heaney's poetry and his politics. I just wanted to take one particular theme, really, and just look at how one image in the poetry is really drawn through a particular period of his work, and why it might matter politically. There's a famous line of W.B. Yeats's, of course, who says that he must go down again where poetry starts, to find inspiration in the foul rag and bone shop of the heart. And it's a statement of the strange relationship between ordinary reality, ordinary human reality, ordinary political reality, which is deeply unpoetic, and the transformation of that experience into what becomes great art. But I was struck just in looking at Heaney's essays that he picks up that phrase but uses it slightly differently, and there's something interesting about the difference. He says, "It is in the rag and bone shop of the instincts that a poetry begins and ends, though it can raise itself by the ladders of intelligence towards a platform and a politics." It's, I think, significant that, of course, it's not that he doesn't know the Yeats phrase, so it's very deliberate to shift from heart to instincts. And what might that mean? About this process of raising ordinary personal and communal experience up, that ladder, through the ladders of intelligence towards a platform and a politics. I don't think he ever raises the experience to a platform in the worst sense. He's not a platform orator. He doesn't have a political program, but he does have a politics, and a politics which is ultimately not should not be divorced from his poetry, from the act of making poetry. But it begins with instinct for him rather than with the heart, and I think the difference is that the heart is individual, and instinct has a wider kind of meaning. It suggests a sense of what's inherited, what's in the DNA, and that has a meaning which is both, of course, familial, literal, bodily, but also communal. What's in the DNA of the world you grow up with. We all have political instincts. We all have assumptions, which very often are not examined, not tested. And one way of thinking about part of what Heaney does poetically is he uses poetry as a crucible in which to test those instincts. Not to deny them, not to occlude them, but to put them under the extraordinary pressure of language, which is what great poets do. And he also, in one of the, this is a piece he wrote in The Guardian in 1972, which was the worst year of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Probably the year at which it seemed most likely that we were looking at full-scale civil war, you know, when things seemed to be completely out of control. I find this use of language very interesting because it seems untypical. He's talking about how in Belfast and in Northern Ireland, destructive elements of all kinds have been unleashed. And then he says, which are even perhaps deeply exhilarating. And it's not quite the way we think about Seamus subsequently, you know, as a figure of such extraordinary political grace. And it's well to remember that there's a moment at which he might be drawn towards the idea of this terrible turmoil, this kind of historic shattering of the status quo, as having a kind of exhilaration. And he makes clear in this piece of, you know, how conflicted he is in terms of trying to, you know, understand and deal with and respond to what's going on. He says, at 1 minute you are drawn towards the old vortex of racial and religious instinct, uses that word again. At another time you seek the mean of humane love and reason. I think subsequently, when we think about Seamus Heaney's political importance and his impact and what he meant to people, what he meant to the peace process, we think about how he drew himself towards that mean of human love and reason, and perhaps forget that as a human being, as a citizen, as a person in the middle of this vortex, he's also drawn in the other direction towards the old religious and racial instincts, which mean essentially the instincts of what it means to be someone who grows up Catholic in Northern Ireland. As of course he does. And what I just want to talk about over the next 3 or 4 hours is just take one little thread, one image really, as to how he tries to find this balance and to deal with something which is instinctively, very profoundly imprinted on Catholic nationalist consciousness in Ireland, and to find a way of using that image differently, and what that might tell us about how he makes a politics out of the foul rag and bone shop of instinct. This sense, of course, is also, you know, I think it becomes very explicit, and it's beautifully expressed in many of the reflections that he does in Dennis O'Driscoll's wonderful series of interviews in Stepping Stones. But it's interesting. He kind of locates this divided self, the way he's pulled in different directions, very much in around that sort of period, because you could say the period at which he's also dealing most directly with language, with etymology, with place names, you know, going very, very deep into that sense of the terrain in which he grew up, is also the period in which the Northern Ireland Troubles are unfolding in the most violent and vicious way. And he's reflecting on all of those wonderful poems that he writes about the etymology of place names, about landscape. He had said something to the effect that I had abandoned history for geology, and that I was now like a climber on a mountainside, feeling out the terrain, and so on. And then it struck me in a kind of Auden-esque second thought that this just wasn't true, that abandoning history was a luxury that the Times had disallowed. And again, I think what's interesting there is that the desire to abandon history is very potent, right? To get away from it, to escape history. James Joyce, of course, his Stephen Dedalus famously says, history is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake. And in different ways, I think you can look at so much of 20th century Irish literature as attempts to escape history and failed attempts to escape history. Writers do not want to be weighed down by the complexities, the violence, the darkness of Irish history, but they cannot find a voice without going through it in some way. So it's something around that tension that I'd just like to explore. And I thought I would really just begin with a phrase that I found in reading and rereading strange and somewhat difficult to quite pin down. And it's just this two-word phrase, make germinate. And I'll maybe just explain why it's a phrase that's bothered me. And of course, if it's there to bother you, it's there to do something, right? It's doing something within the poem that it appears in. It's almost like one of those stones that are placed on streets in Germany, to trip you up and remind you of history, and that you cannot get away from what might have happened here before. So the context in which the phrase appears is what I think is, most people would agree, is a kind of key poem of turning. Very much a poem that comes out of this period when Heaney's trying to find a way to react to the Troubles. And of course, it's one of the poems. It's the first poem in which he begins this sequence where he deals with the bog bodies, which obviously hit him at a very profound level. These bodies, which he of course had not physically seen at this stage, but were written about and illustrated in P.V. Glob's book about them. These are Danish bog bodies rather than Irish ones. It's neither here nor there, but it is interesting that since then you can now go to the museum in Dublin and see bog bodies. You couldn't back then. They seemed to be out there somewhere. Whereas of course his basic instinct that they connected somehow to Ireland was completely right at every sort of level. Literally the same kinds of things were going on in ancient Ireland. But the phrase appears in this sequence where he brilliantly evokes Tolland man. And then he says, I could risk blasphemy, consecrate the cauldron bog, our holy ground, and pray him to make germinate the scattered, ambushed flesh of labourers, stockinged corpses laid out in the farmyards, telltale skin and teeth flecking the sleepers of 4 young brothers trailed for miles along the lines. So the phrase then is embedded in what's arguably the most shocking image of violence we have in the whole body of Heaney's work. He writes elegies, he evokes violence in so many great poems, but I don't think there's an image as shocking anywhere, as direct, as visceral in the work as this one, which is not taken out of his head, it's taken out of a reality. It refers to an incident during the first period of the Troubles, and almost forgotten now the degree of sectarian violence in what becomes Northern Ireland around the birth of Northern Ireland in 1921. And this is a particularly horrific incident where 4 Catholic brothers were murdered by the B Specials, who were the very sectarian, loyalist, unionist, irregular force. And their bodies were trailed along the railway line, which ran very closely behind the Heaney's house, right? So it's bringing you back into that landscape. It's very much about place, but it's also the first time you read the poem, the second time you read the poem, the third time you read the poem, you're shocked by the visceral imagery, and then you come back to this phrase, "make germinate." So what's the prayer? He's praying to the Tolland man, right? So he's saying, I'll make him the deity, and I will pray to him to make germinate the teeth and flesh and scattered bits of body of these young brothers who had been killed in this horrific way. And then you think, well, okay, so the phrase itself has a kind of decorousness, to make germinate, which is at odds with where it leads you, right? It's not, if you were just looking at the phrase on its own, you're going to think about beautiful plants, greenhouses, whatever it is. You're not going to be thinking about this. So it's a little trap of a phrase that's kind of leading you unsuspecting into this very shocking set of images, which are history. This is history. But also linguistically, it's an interesting kind of phrase. It's a very Latinate phrase for a start, so it comes from Latin, which of course he knew and loved. The bog poems, as he develops them, the language is not Latinate. He's very deliberately, very often using a language which is rooted in Anglo-Saxon to link it to Scandinavia. So the linguistic landscape is very specific, and so germinate is not a word that you kind of would put with that. And he's using it. He's using it in a transitive sense, which as the Oxford English tells us is to cause to begin to grow, to bring about the growth of, specifically to cause a seed to undergo germination. And then it says, in early use, chiefly in figurative contexts, right? So it's not a phrase that's generally in use, and when it is in use, it's generally used figuratively. So what is it exactly? What does it mean here? Flesh, scattered flesh, can't grow, or the idea of it growing, if we thought of it, would be Gothic and horrific. If we just thought about it in that sort of very direct logical sense. So I was just kind of bothered by what is this phrase doing and what's it doing politically and where can we locate it. And what I think it's doing is, of course, so it's not just germinate, it's make germinate. Human beings, again, can't make seeds germinate. We can plant them, we can create the conditions, we don't make them germinate. And I think what he's using, germinate in a very particular way that is not in the dictionary, which is to make it capable of germination. So germinate in the sense of having the potential to germinate. And what might that mean in the context of a very specific, visceral, difficult, almost repulsive image of politics and history? What could you make germinate out of this history is, I think, in a way, what he's asking us to think about here. And then I just wanted to think about why that phrase might mean something to him. It's worth noting, of course, the telltale skin and teeth are flecking the sleepers. Sleepers is, of course, a literal sleepers of the railway line, but Heaney doesn't use words without, having a full sense of their different capacities. And it introduces another idea here, right, which is that these dead might be also sleeping. They might be sleepers. Very long traditions of thinking about the dead as only sleeping and being able to come back in some form. So let's just stand back for a second and think about the world in which Heaney's born and which he grows up. There's not time or it wouldn't be the place to really go into a very long description of this, but I just thought, I just came across this, it kind of gives you a little window into it. This is the Belfast newsletter from February 28th, 1953, and it has this extraordinarily poignant little news story, which is about the death of Seamus's younger brother Christopher, which is, of course, there very much in his poetry, in his memory, and in his sense of the world. So Christopher was 3.5, of course, died crossing the road just outside the house, and it's a terribly poignant because it's so clipped. It's just a news story. It's a report on the inquest. But I just thought it might give you a little indication of the world, right? What's on the same newspaper page? What are the other stories? Inniskillings recruit well. The Inniskillings are the Inniskilling regiment of the British Army. Recruitment's going well. The court and personal report of the Mr. Geoffrey Alchin was received in audience by the Queen this morning and kissed hands upon his appointment as Her Majesty's Envoy Extraordinary and Minister Plenipotentiary at Luxembourg. The Queen visits the BBC. And a piece about a book on the sayings of Queen Elizabeth. This is actually Queen Elizabeth I, right? It just gives you a sense now that this is a Protestant newspaper, right? So the Belfast Telegraph is a Protestant newspaper. So this little bit of Seamus Heaney's life, this terrible event in the family, appears in this kind of context where this is the way the world works. This is how politics works. This is how power works. This is how you're supposed to think of yourself and think about your identity. Another just tiny little illustration, which is less poignant and more comic. This is a report from the Ulster Herald in 1970, by which stage Seamus Heaney was reasonably famous as a poet. I mean, he had 2 volumes out and another one just coming, and it's a report allegedly of an encounter between Seamus Heaney and the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, who was Major Chichester Clark. The Chichester Clarks were the big old landowning family in the neighbourhood that Seamus grew up in. Chichester Clark, when he moved on from being Prime Minister, was Lord Moyola. Moyola, of course, is a sound, a name, a river that runs through many of Heaney's poems. But this apparently is an encounter. It's reporting that Seamus has gone off on a sabbatical to Berkeley State University in California. And then it said, somebody reports that quite recently, I've been told the gallant Major Chichester Clark was introduced to the poet at a reception to mark the opening of something or other. Heaney, said the Prime Minister, from Balahi. I knew a man, he went on, named Heaney from Balahi. He was on the county council with me. Seamus explained that Heaney was indeed his father. The Prime Minister was delighted. John Heaney was a fine man, and what do you do for a living, young man? And it's just so wrong at every single possible level, right? So it's not just that he doesn't know who Seamus Heaney is, but Seamus Heaney's father was not John Heaney, he was not on the county council with him, it's just that level also of class and condescension. So as well as living in this world, which is a British world, or presents itself as a British world, there's also a world of social class as well, which we often kind of forget, that being a cattle dealer's son from South Derry is not quite the same as being the owner of the large estate over the wall from Castle Dawson, right? And never the twain shall meet in a way, and when they do meet, it's full of complete misunderstanding. So what's the alternative, the alternative way of thinking, the alternative set of assumptions? What are the instincts, the racial and religious instincts that Heaney might be referring to in that quotation? And the alternatives are of course, those, what I would call structures of feeling of Irish Catholic nationalism. Again, I won't bore you with going into everything that they might be, but there's a particular set of, and I say structure of feeling, it might sound like a very paradoxical sort of phrase, but political communities have mythologies, have images, have a kind of poetry, kind of figurative language or way of thinking that structures their feeling, whether they know it or not, in a sense. These are the things that are most potent when they're the assumptions you make, the things you inherit, the ways in which you think about the world. And there are three particular kind of interrelated aspects of this that I just want to talk about. There's martyrdom, the importance of martyrdom. There's the related idea that the body politic, which is the body of Irish resistance to British rule, is like the body of an incorruptible saint. You know, the way the body of a saint is often identified by the fact that when you dig up her body, it's incorrupt. And so this idea that the dead, the Irish dead, the patriot dead, remain incorruptible in their death. And then the kind of third phase of that, which is the idea that the national life, the real national life of the future, will spring from the grave. So the grave is not just where the dead are buried, it is the place from which the utopian future will emerge. So those things are very, very important to this structure of feeling. And going back to Tall Man, to the poem that contains this "Make Germinate," Heaney himself, in his essay "Feeling into Words," says that he's one of the reasons he's responding to the bog bodies is that they have a quality that links for him into this whole set of Irish Catholic nationalist mythologies and the sense of death, the sense of the grave, the sense of what comes out of the grave. So he talks about Tullen Man, and he says that taken in relation to the tradition of Irish political martyrdom for that cause, whose icon is Kathleen Ní Houlihan, this is more than an archaic, barbarous rite. It is an archetypal pattern. And so it's what archetypal pattern might be at work in this phrase "make germinate" is really just what I want to unfold. So martyrdom, as understood in the Irish nationalist tradition, the embodiment of it is Robert Emmet, the patriot was executed by the British in 1803 after a failed rising. Has a kind of strange kind of afterlife. If you know anybody in America whose first name is Emmett, it comes from Robert Emmet. It's a strange kind of thing that becomes a first name in America. But he's the sort of, as I said, the great romantic nationalist martyr hero. Young, beautiful, idealistic, incorruptible, and it's interesting that the cult of Emmet, or the idea of Emmet, was profoundly influenced and revived. I mean, it was there all the time, but it was very much revived around the centenary of his execution. And one of the people who was very active in doing this is William Butler Yeats. And Yeats gives a big talk in New York in 1904, And he frames this way of thinking about Emmet poetically. This young man came along and laid his life down. He showed that there was something in Ireland which not all the wealth of the world could purchase. He seemed to say to England, how can you permanently triumph? What can you offer to us if we do not fear to leave even life itself? And then Yeats uses this phrase about Emmet. He said, Emmet's ideal had arisen incorruptible. Right? So it arises from the grave like the body of a saint, as it were. And one of the most famous texts that pretty much all Irish Catholic nationalists families would have encountered this text, because it's almost of the same kind of standing as sacred scripture, and it's Emmet's speech from the dock, his famous last speech, where he really kind of opens up this idea that he's addressing a future which has not yet come into being. Let them and me repose in obscurity and peace, and my tomb remain uninscribed until other times and other men can do justice to my character, when my country takes her place among the nations of the earth. Then and not till then, let my epitaph be written, I have done. So this idea that in a sense, Irish reality, the real Ireland, is something that's going to emerge from obscure graves, and that the incorruptible body, the incorruptible ideal of the martyr is the ground from which it will spring. Seamus appeared, so far as I can ascertain, in two melodramas which were about Robert Emmet. In 1959 and 1960. So he was a student at Queen's University at this time. And it's sort of normal, natural to think of him as kind of getting away from all of this old kind of Irish melodrama, Irish nationalist melodrama. But he acted with the Wolfe Tone Dramatic Society in the GAA Hall in Balahi. One of these was called For the Land She Loved. But much more interestingly is the one in 1960, where he appeared not just in a play about Robert Emmet, but as Robert Emmet. Right? And it's in a play called Melody Alone, which I think is quite a short play. I haven't been able to find a copy of it. I'm going to move heaven and earth to find one if anybody knows anybody who has one. But it's clearly Robert Emmet's last hours, you know, the moment leading up to martyrdom. And it has all the kind of, so these melodramas would have been in everybody's head. The cast of characters, Robert Emmet, Major Sir, who is the villain of the piece, and Sarah Curran, who is Robert Emmet's love. So it kind of mixes sort of kind of romantic sentimental drama with nationalist martyrdom. And these were the staple of Irish drama. You know, we think about Yeats and O'Casey and Sing and all that, but you know, actually, if you wanted to look at what was being done all the time, you know, it was still these things. This is from the Mid-Ulster Observer in April 1960. Never can there have been a more true characterization. Is there a better portrayal of the darling of Erin? We think not. And it uses words like fiery, idealistic, and noble about the young student who's playing Robert Emmet, who is Seamus Heaney, who had just celebrated his 21st birthday. What's interesting about this? Well, it's interesting in itself, of course, if you're doing what I'm doing, is writing a biography. But it's also fascinating because it's not something Seamus Heaney ever talks about. Ever, you know, so it sort of disappears in a way from the way he wants to think about himself. This is perfectly reasonable, by the way. And you know, but if anybody looks at anything I did when I'm 21, you know, I would be extremely angry about it. Just stay away from it. But Emmet doesn't really appear in the poems, except in one poem called "The Old Icons," which is one of the Sweeney poems at the end of Station Island. There's that kind of sequence which are sort of inspired by or in dialogue with the Sweeney idea, and it begins with, "Why, when it was all over, did I hold on to them?" And it lists kind of old icons. And one of them is a patriot with folded arms in a shaft of light. The barred cell windows and his sentenced face are the only bright spots in the little etching. And so what's interesting, that it actually matches the scenario of this play, all right, which is the hero with the shaft of light coming in and he's about to go to his death, his sentenced face. But it's framed in this implication of, why the hell did I hold on to this thing? Why is this coming back to me? I don't really want to know about it. And also, it's turned, so the theatrical experience is turned into an etching or a kind of a visual image, a picture. It's also very interesting that this poem is one that he leaves out of the selected poems, 66 to 87, the kind of first big volume of selected poems, even though most of the other poems around it are included in that volume. So he doesn't want to go there. And of course, if you're a biographer, you want to think about the places that people don't want to go. In Stepping Stones, I said that wonderful book with Dennis O'Driscoll. He actually, Dennis O'Driscoll asked him about did you see any of these plays, when you were young? And he said, oh yeah, I saw these historical pageants based on the rebellion and capture and execution of Robert Emmet. But he says that he saw them performed by a traveling professional troupe. And Dennis asks him, he says, did seeing these plays imbue you with the ambition to perform? And he says, not at all. No. And that's it. I mean, you would think he would say, well, actually, I did kind of perform in one. I performed in two, but I actually played Robert Emmet. He doesn't want to say it. All right, and this is to me completely understandable. It's because, of course, these memories are being shaped in a very different context, right? So they're being shaped in a context where the Robert Emmet stuff, all of that sentimental melodrama, but also particularly this idea that out of the graves of the dead is going to arise something else, that changes its meaning, right? So between 1960 and 1970. The meaning of these images, of this structure of feeling, is going to be altered by historical events. History is going to come in, and it's going to take them out of sentimental melodrama and make them something much more like a reenactment of the 1920s, when the flesh and bones and teeth are being scattered by extreme violence. However, there's another little kind of window into this as well, which is this is the first big documentary film that was made that rescued and garnered and brought together footage from newsreels and very early documentary on the revolutionary years in Ireland. And it was made in 1959. It's called Misha Era, I Am Ireland. And it's a wonderful piece of archival restoration by the great George Morrison. But it has a narrative which is very much triumphalist. I mean, it's very much simple. We were oppressed by the Brits, and then all this great stuff happened, and it ends with the triumph of Sinn Féin in the elections, and it kind of doesn't go into the Civil War, but it sort of ends there. So it's kind of, okay, this is where Ireland is reawakened, right? So it's about the reawakening of Ireland, which would very much be a part of the structure of feeling, right? It's very much there as the way in which you just inherit it. I would have inherited, even, being much younger than Seamus. It was still just the way you thought about that part of Irish history. Okay, Misha Era, again, 1960. see history reenacted it as it actually happened. Misha, famous Galen film, the epic film of Ireland from 1890 to 1919, in the Wolfe-Tone GA Hall in Balahi. There are 3 showings. Interestingly, you might just look at you can't see the bottom of it. The bottom of it says, this is the second showing of this film in the 6 counties. Now, the film's been around since 1959, right? So this was a film that was not to be shown in Northern Ireland because the authorities didn't want it shown. It was the counter-narrative. It was valorizing and making real and making visual this other story of Irish history, which was not the one that Her Majesty the Queen would have liked. So it says, this is the second showing of this film in the 6 counties, and it will be the only chance South Derry people will have of seeing it. And you probably can't see this from here, but it says tickets for Friday and Sunday showing can be held at Breslin's Shop, Diamonds Cafe, and from Seamus Heaney, phone Balahi 257. So again, it situates them much more directly in the recuperation of this structure of feeling. This film is immensely influential. It has a famous, wonderful score by Sean O'Riordan. It's hugely popular in Catholic nationalist Ireland. And it's just this little kind of moment. So I just wanted to take you into a little bit about the film. So the centerpiece of the film is a funeral, a burial, and the idea that it is from this grave that the future is going to emerge. Right? So the commentary, this is O'Donovan Rossa was a Fenian who died in America. His body is brought back, and his burial in Glasnevin Cemetery, in retrospect, is a kind of precursor to the 1916 Rising, and he's paraded through the streets of Dublin, the dead body, and the commentary says, O'Donovan Rossa was dead, but when his body was brought to Dublin, his spirit still remained, right? And the film shows you the body, the dead body. I mean, you literally see, you see this bit of it, this idea of the preserved body of the patriot dead. And then you have the most famous part of this was Patrick Pearse's oration at the graveside of O'Donovan Rossa. I once saw a man in Donegal at the height of the Troubles stand on a bar stool after about 16 pints and suddenly become completely sober and did the entire Pearse's oration at the graveside of O'Donovan Rossa, word perfect, and then fell off the bar stool. But it was very much in the public consciousness. And the famous bit of this, so there's this little tiny bit there where you can actually see Pearse. I think it's the only bit of actual documentary that we have of this moment. And Pearse says, "Let us understand that after all death comes resurrection, and that from this grave and the graves surrounding us will rise the freedom of Ireland. Life springs from death. And from the graves of patriot men and women spring living nations." Right? This is the kind of key phrase, and it's one, of course, that is going to be taken up by Seamus Heaney. The culmination of the narration of this film says, O'Donovan Rossa and his friends sowed the seed. But it's these young men, and we see the young men around the grave, who are the young men who are going to go out in 1916. It's these young men who will reap the harvest. So this image of life coming from the grave is linked very much to this idea of seed and harvest, and so I think this is part of the structure of feeling that I'm talking about. And of course, then he writes his poem, his 1966 poem, which is the 50th anniversary of the 1916 Rising, but in turn is framed around the 1798 Rising. And so even that gesture itself is sort of part of this assumption, right? Which is that there's a whole series of risings. We lose, we die, but from those graves, the next one is going to happen, right? That sort of idea is very, very powerfully present. And of course, he takes up exactly that imagery, right? So he takes up exactly the image of the seed, the harvest, the grave, the next generation of revolutionaries coming from the grave. So, of course, the poem begins, the pockets of our greatcoats full of barley, and then it ends with, so the image, of course, is that they stick the barley in their pockets, they're going out to battle, they get killed, they get thrown in a mass grave, but the barley seeds will sprout, and out of those seeds will, of course, come the future. They buried us without shroud or coffin, and in August, the barley grew up out of the grave. So you can see him here very much kind of using, it's a very beautiful poem. It works superbly, and it's extraordinarily powerful, both in and of itself, but also because it gives an extraordinary kind of artistic and elegant form to a trope, a way of thinking, an instinct that's already present very much in the way Irish nationalism thinks about itself. Seamus talked about this as having oblique implications. I quite rather like that word. He says, you know, the poem was born of and ended with an image of resurrection based on the fact that sometime after the rebels were buried in common graves, these graves began to sprout with young barley, growing up from barley corn which the croppies had carried in their pockets to eat while on the march. The oblique implication was that the seeds of violent resistance sowed in the year of liberty had reflowered in what Yeats called the Right Rose Tree of 1916. But then famously, of course, as he said, he didn't realize that this imagery was going to, again, take on a very specific historic meaning, right? So it's going to move from the field of generalized structure of feeling into program for political action, right? And famously, as people probably know, this was one of his most popular poems at readings in the late 1960s, and then he stopped reading it. He did not read it thereafter in public. Why? Because the meaning has changed by historical events. So it's a very strong example of how history will not leave the poetry alone, right? The poem does not intend to say, and by the way, wouldn't it be great if the IRA started putting bombs in cafes in Belfast, right? It doesn't mean to say that, but it's going to be read as saying that. It's going to be heard as saying that in the context of the violence. And then, of course, he famously says, using this wonderful phrase, he says that at that moment, I didn't realize that the original heraldic murderous encounter between Protestant yeoman and Catholic rebel was to be initiated again in the summer of 1969 in Belfast, 2 months after the book was published, the book that contains this poem. From that moment, the problems of poetry moved from being simply a matter of achieving the satisfactory verbal icon to being a search for images and symbols adequate to our predicament. So the images and symbols now have to be not just satisfactory verbal icons, which the Requiem for the Croppies is a superb verbal icon, but they have to be adequate to our predicament, and that's a very different kind of task, and it's the one that he responds to. Just worth noting that at the end, the way that poem ends, so it's a sonnet used as a kind of dramatic monologue, but using we instead of I, which you usually expect in a sonnet. So it's a rare enough poem in which Heaney is speaking vatically. He's speaking almost on behalf of the tribe, we, you know. And it's also worth noting that it's built into the structure of the poem itself. That closure is precluded. It's like a Shakespearean sonnet. Shakespearean sonnets end with a new couplet, right, comes in at the end. It's its own thing. It has its own rhyme. This doesn't. It repeats the rhyme. And so you're kind of stuck with the sense of this is not over. You know, this is going to continue. And it's one thing to say that and write it and make you feel it in your head with the rhythm of the poem in 1966 or 1967. It's a different thing in 1969 or 1970. So sorry, I'm going to move on because I'm going on too long. However, so you have in Heaney saying these contrary impulses, right? So there is the impulse which is the inherited collective impulse, which comes out very much in a poem like that. The contrary impulse is sort of wonderfully expressed in Fosterage, which is about an encounter with Michael McClaverty, the wonderful novelist who was very important to Seamus Heaney. He taught in the school where McClaverty was headmaster, and McClaverty was a kind of very important kind of forebearer as a writer from a Catholic background in Northern Ireland. But he quotes McClaverty as saying to him in this encounter in the poem, "Don't have the veins bulging in your biro." Right? And it's a wonderfully demotic phrase, but it sort of captures the sense that you can't write with rage. You can't write out of the anger that we all feel. You know, that's not what you can do as a poet. And so there's that image, and then, you know, there's also the sense, again, we rightly think of Seamus as being extraordinarily forgiving and benign, which he is. But again, it's important to take us back into 1970, 71, 72. It's not that easy to be benign. You know, the force of the violence, the force of history is making that incredibly difficult. He writes in The Listener in 1971, he says, "A little goodwill in the establishment here towards the notion of being Irish would take some of the twists out of the minority." And he says then, "Even at this time, it's difficult to extend full sympathy to the predicament of that million among us," which is the Protestant population, "who would ask the other 500,000 to exalt themselves by being humbled." Right? So, you know, this is not gentle, nice, gracious stuff. It's a huge dilemma about, you know, you don't want to have the veins bulging in your biro, but also too easy sympathy, too easy forgiveness at that point in history would be trite and would actually become banal, and would actually be also read as a sort of surrender. You know, it's just giving in to the status quo, which is very much not what he wants to do. So how do you find a way of doing this? How do you do it then in terms of rethinking that image, rethinking the image of what comes out of the grave and the image of what germinates, what harvest, what seed, that I think is where we find him. In Kinship, he says, "Our mother ground is sour with the blood of her faithful." That word sour is a very different word from the word of the nationalist martyr tradition, right? The tradition that Requiem for the Croppies comes out of is that our mother ground, our earth, our Ireland is rich with the blood, enriched by the blood of our faithful, of her faithful, those who have been faithful to her, right? And here he's saying it's sour with the blood of the, you know, it's a very different kind of image, and this is being forced in a way by events, by history. He starts thinking differently even about land. There's this image in the poem called Land, which is in Wintering Out. Which kind of seems like, again, it's one of those poems he does so brilliantly where you're kind of led into thinking that this is a very sweet poem. "I sense the paths unfurling under grass and clover. If I lie with my ear in this loop of silence, I must not be surprised in the bursting air, and then suddenly to find myself snared, swinging an ear ring of sharp wire." Right? So the land itself, the earth, in which the dead are buried, is becoming a trap, a snare. He's now, you know, instead of just lying there bucolically in this lovely landscape, he's thinking of himself as like an animal being caught in a trap, a hidden trap. And so this imagery of seeds, of earth, of what can be in this violent earth, you know, I think is what's weighing on him. It's interesting that he was thinking about calling his next book at this point Winter Seeds. And I think winter seeds is a very interesting kind of phrase itself, isn't it? Because it's what can you sow in the bleak time rather than, spring. You don't sow in winter. He's thinking it's inspired by the fact that these seeds had been found in the stomach of the Tolland man, so that's where he's thinking of it. And he uses this phrase in the Tolland man, his last gruel of winter seeds caked in his stomach. But it asks us really to think about burial, about graves, about what can emerge. He will eventually end up in the Cura Troy in one of his most famous one of the most famous passages. So Pierce says, from the graves of patriot men and women spring living nations. Cura Troy says, history says, don't hope this side of the grave. The Irish national tradition is, you hope on the side of the grave. He's saying, don't hope this side of the grave. So what happens if you can't really hope on the side of the grave? What happens if you have to think about the image of seeding and germination in winter, the winter of bleak times? What is it that can be made to germinate? And what can be made to germinate is, famously, as he says, subtleties and tolerances. He talks about this wonderful image of doing a reading in the BBC in Belfast and listening to the bombs going off outside and just thinking, what the hell is the point of reading poetry? And then saying, well, the only thing we have is that it was not necessary to deal directly with political issues because the subtleties and tolerances of their art were precisely what they had to contribute to the coarseness and intolerances of public life. And it is these subtleties and tolerances that ultimately will germinate politically in the Belfast Agreement. He said this himself. He said, in the end, I believe that what was envisaged and almost set up by the Good Friday Agreement was prefigured in what I called our subtleties and tolerances, allowances for different traditions and cultures, different traditions and affiliations in culture, religion, and politics. So this culture of allowance, of subtlety and tolerance. And I just want to, then how does he do this? Finally, we come to a poem which is a response to this from this period, really, where he's trying to think about making something germinate, using these same imageries that have been instinct in so much of what his past is. And it's this wonderful poem, The Other Side. It's very interesting reading the wonderful volume of letters which has come out, and looking at the letters himself, that he was very, very anxious. This poem was not originally intended to be in the volume it appeared in. And it's one that he's harassing the editors to say, I really, really want this poem in now. It has an urgency to it. And he says, I don't want to come across as being all messianic, but I want this poem in. It has an urgency. And you read the poem and it does not initially feel urgent. So what's urgent about this poem in this winter, this dark time, this terrible period of 1970-71? And it's a poem it actually goes back to the thing of lying there. He's lying there kind of bucolically. And the Heaney feels the better fields of a Protestant farmer called John Juncan. And it's about Juncan is sort of looking with sort of contempt over at the Heaney fields. And, so it's a poem that kind of contains, in a way, or should contain, all the fundamental rage of the land, the division, the unequal division. And what happens is that he's looking over the fields, and so the poem again is wonderfully constructed. A lot of the poem is about language, so it's about the fact that Juncan, the Protestant farmer, uses biblical language all the time, and he kind of says, "Well, you Catholics, you don't know this stuff, do you? Because you don't read the good book. You wouldn't know this language." And so Heaney Of course, part of the beauty of the poem is that he's showing his own mastery of that language by using it. So it's a kind of revenge, but the best kind of revenge, right? Which is actually showing that he can take that Protestant biblical language too, and make wonderful poetry out of it. But the image in this poem is that the Protestant farmer is carelessly swinging his blackthorn over the weeds, and thereby scattering the seeds of the weeds into the Heaney's field, right? So that, and he's saying, nothing really good grows in your field. And the poem's kind of saying, yeah, because you're bloody well knocking all those horrible seeds into it, without even thinking about it. Swinging his blackthorn at the marsh weeds, he prophesied above our scraggy acres, then turned away towards his promised furrows on the hill, a wake of pollen drifting to our bank, next season's tares. And it's that word tares, like germinate, that sort of makes you stop and you think, that's an unusual word. Where did I hear that before? And there's only one place you can ever get that word, really, which is in the King James Bible. It's a phrase for what would have been a phrase that Protestants would have known, and maybe a lot of Catholics wouldn't have known. So Johnny Junkin has been sort of half comically, but half seriously kind of identified with a biblical prophet, because he's using this. The prophecy is a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? He's knocking the seeds into the field, and he's prophesying that those acres will be scraggy, So he's kind of creating his own prophecy. But this word tares is actually, when you think about it, actually very beautiful, right? Because it refers to the passage in the Gospel of Matthew where Jesus tells this parable, right? And he says, what is the kingdom of heaven, right? And he says, the kingdom of heaven is like unto a man which sowed good seed in his field, right? So that in itself, it's taking us back into this imagery of sowing. While the man slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went his way. That's Johnny Junkin has just done this, right? He's sowed the tares in the field and gone his way. But when the blade was sprung up and brought forth fruit, then appeared the tares also, right? So when the harvest comes, there's the good stuff, the wheat you want, and then there's the tares, which are the weeds. So the servants of the household came and said unto him, Sir, didst not thou sow good seed in thy field? From whence then hath it tares? He said unto them, An enemy hath done this. The servant said unto him, Wilt thou then that we go and gather them up? But he said, Nay, lest while ye gather up the tares, ye root up the wheat with them. Let them both grow together until the harvest. And I think that really is the image he finds, right? To in a way, honor and continue this structure of feeling about planting, about what comes up, about making germinate. But what's made germinate just in that word tares, and with the whole scenario that he creates on this, is the idea that, yes, it might have been planted by your enemy. It might have come from a whole history of dispossession, of poverty, of condescension, of all of those kinds of things. But you have to let the two grow together. So what must come up has to be multiple. It cannot be just one single tradition, one single way of thinking about history. And I think that's where the foul rag and bone shop of instinct produces a ladder into a politics that will ultimately itself germinate as history. And it's a history in which, for all the continuing difficulties of Ireland, we are fortunate to be living. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Our thanks to Fintan O'Toole for that wonderful talk. We have time for just a couple questions. If you would raise your hand, if you have a question, Avi or I will come toward you. There's one right behind you, and that way everyone can hear your question with a microphone. You want to raise your hand there again? Yes, thanks.
Fintan, that was brilliant. It was absolutely brilliant.
Thank you.
I'm thinking about the personal versus the communal.
Yes.
It seems to say that in your reading, and maybe it works like that, instincts would be the personal. And you read it when you translate it into the communal into a form of atavism. It's an atavism which leads us into this kind of, communal history with all its implications. And that we read as a move towards politics. And the move towards the personal is a retreat from politics, right? It's as if these two poles. And yet, and maybe that's the point of what you're showing us here to an extent, for Heaney, the personal is also a form of alternative politics, isn't it? I mean, that to me seems to be the point, in the same way that the bog metaphor, it's deep, it's multi-layered, it leads us down to an individual at the very bottom of the bog, which is personal and yet it's communal at the same time, that these kind of subtleties and tolerances that you speak about in the end are individual, they're personal. It's not about, like you say, a big political statement, a big platform. And that's the birth of the germination of the seed for a new kind of politics.
Yes. Yes, thank you very much. That puts it much better than I did, and it's. I will steal all of that when I'm writing, David. But I think you're absolutely right. Because and this is not just about Seamus or about Ireland or about the past. It's very much about the present, which is that we need a politics of humanity. Politics has to be based on the idea of the importance of individuality of every single person. And that's the politics that he creates in his public persona. I think the sort of generosity, the sense of treating everybody with dignity, but also in the poems themselves. That actually that body of work with the intricacy of one set of perceptions, one life, one small community, one small place, how so much of life can be contained within those moments and those visions. That in itself, I mean, even if you leave aside all those sort of larger political statements, that is a very profound political statement, I think, because it takes us back to that essential humanity. And of course, in that poem, it's followed, that section about Johnny Junkin is followed by this very beautiful image. So that there's a third section to that poem where we suddenly see Johnny Junkin not sort of waving his blackthorn stick, but waiting outside the Heaney home while they're saying the rosary inside, because he doesn't want to interfere, but he also wants to be welcomed into the house. So, and it's to write that poem at that time in that context, is a highly political act.
Hi. I just want to say thank you for giving this talk. It was amazing. I really enjoyed it. I was wondering, you skipped over the slide on kinship, but while you were talking, I couldn't forget the manuscript I saw of kinship where he had crossed out the line, I grew as a willow tree back into the attitudes of gravity, and he crossed it out and he changed it to inclined to the attitude of gravity. And I was wondering if you had a reading on that in terms of this political germination rather than, because I read it the first time as like a personal thing.
That's a wonderful point. Thank you very much. I think in a way that poem is a sort of response to a Tennyson poem. So I wasn't going to bore you with all this, but this phrase that he had used in kinship is, I grew out of all of this like a weeping willow, inclined to the appetites of gravity. And you were saying that it was in the manuscript. So just tell us again. It was back into the appetites. Yeah. So it's. I think what he's saying to us is that he's very profoundly drawn towards that whole imagery, towards that whole sense of the grave. The willow is traditionally associated with the graveyard. So, and of course, in a very different set of contexts. I mean, he is one of the great poets of communion with the dead. You know, that's going on all the time. But I think this inclination is also to do with Tennyson's lines, which he quotes in Feeling into Words. Old yew which graspeth at the stones that name the underlying dead, thy fibres net the dreamless head, thy roots are wrapped about the bones. You know, it's a very chilling kind of phrase, and I think he's responding to that as well, and really kind of placing himself almost in the same sort of instinct, you know, towards that. But I think the thing about the willow is it shouldn't reach down into the grave, you know. So it's I think that change is very striking, and I think it's a very good point you make, that he doesn't want to go fully there, but is aware of the fact that his natural inclinations are towards it, and in a way then they're inclinations that he has to sort of both honor and in some ways fight against, I think.
We can do one last question.
Thank you very much. How do you do? I'm just wondering if you've found any reasoning for why Heaney decided that poetry was the best thing to, say, make germinate his message, as opposed to, say, acting. You know, of course, it's mildly speculative. Maybe he's just a better poet than player. But I'm just wondering if there's if at least he had any reasoning behind that you found.
I mean, I think he sort of found himself growing into it, you know, as I suppose a lot of poets do. I mean, I don't think he grew up thinking that I'm going to be a poet, you know, but nonetheless, he does start writing poems quite early. And I think just recognizing the possibility of a voice. But it's a very good question to ask, because we take it for granted, of course, he's going to become a poet. But of course, he's also a magnificent prose writer. For example, you know, you read his prose, the essays are wonderful works of art in themselves. So you know, even in terms of writing, he has these capacities. And of course, he was a brilliant orator when he chose to be, you know. So I mean, he could have used those linguistic gifts in so many different ways. There's something in the air in Belfast, I think, at that time. You know, it can't be just coincidental, I think. And of course, it's a thing we know, isn't it? How art does emerge. One person on their own may not take that leap to try to develop a particular art form, whether it's rock music or painting or whatever else it is. But when you have a group of people, I think that's where you get the validation, the competition a little bit, the sense that actually, you know, this is something I can do as well as, or maybe slightly better than other people. And you can see a kind of pleasure emerging in that. You know, he obviously responded as a reader, I think, first to poetry. He obviously benefited from that kind of education where he has a lot of poems in his head. You know, he would have learned enormous numbers of poems off by heart, and the rhythms are there. That music is there for him, I think. And then I think it's just discovering. So I don't think he's thinking about a message and how he can communicate it. I think he's thinking about the music of this thing, and I can sing in this way, and then what do I sing about? You know, I think that comes after. And of course, then he's always drawn for all the rest of his career between, you know, why the hell do I have to respond to history? Can I not just be myself? Can I not just make my own sounds? You know, and he writes very brilliant poems which give himself permission to not have to deal with any of this stuff. And then the next poem is dealing with the stuff, you know, because he can't escape it. So thank you very much indeed.